I'm borrowing now on the work of any number of theorists, including Ken Wilber. The idea here is that during the Middle Ages, when the church has all the power, these three spheres of arts, morals, and science are like three quarters that you would stack on top of each other. Do you got me? In other words, you have a quarter that is arts, you have a quarter that is morals, and you have a quarter that is science. During the Middle Ages, those three quarters stack on top of each other, and that is to say, they are undifferentiated. They're not separated. Well, can you give me an idea of how I can understand that in some kind of real time? I can. Last time we took students, for example, over to Rome, we went into the Vatican. We walked into the Vatican and we stood in the Sistine Chapel, which is two things, remarkably small. My students were like really shocked. It's like not a room much bigger than 303. And we looked up at the ceiling and we saw that amazing painting there that you've probably seen before, right? We saw that painting there by who? The great Michelangelo. Question: Michelangelo was an incredibly gifted artist who produced almost entirely all of his work to celebrate what? The church. Why? Because the church had all the power. In other words, during this time of the Dark Ages, the church will tell us what is beautiful, what is good and right, and what science is. There's no discussion points here because the church has all of the power. However, we begin to move into the Enlightenment and the time of modernity. These three value spheres will start to separate. Back to my word picture of the three quarters. They start to pull apart so that now you actually will have three quarters laying on your table where you will have arts, you will have morals, and you will have science. Now, you could argue that Francis Bacon is one of the first ones to point out that the church definitely needs to have its power in regards to morals. Francis Bacon, a practicing Christian, says we definitely need to have the church telling us what's right and what's wrong. However, the church increasingly should stay out of the domain of the arts. In other words, for the first time, Shakespeare will write plays where religious topics are kind of tangential to what really is going on stage. For example, you just watched a performance of Merchant of Venice. I mean, it's a classic example. Merchant of Venice has an underlying Christian theme, no question, right? And it's going to help us to understand the tension between, for example, Shylock and, of course, Shylock's offspring and everything else that's going on in the play. But you could argue, and I think rightfully so, that there's a whole lot more going on in Merchant of Venice than simply some kind of Christian theology at play. So in other words, Shakespeare is going to take over in many ways this idea of the arts. All of a sudden, from about 1600 on, you start to have artists who will then begin to produce work that doesn't have anything to do with Christianity, right? Think, of course, of the different examples that we could provide here come to mind. Think about the power of Dante in Divine Commedia, and especially the Inferno, a text that we're about to study. You could argue that Dante is actually playing a game of synthesis that's quite modern. And here again, we'll sometimes label Dante as the originator of the Renaissance. It depends. Think about Machiavelli. You read The Prince. How much of the Bible is mentioned in The Prince? Don't say not at all, because Machiavelli will say one of his greatest understandings of great leadership is Moses. He will have studied the Bible, but notice there's kind of this pulling apart. We're going to call it again differentiation. Finally, there is the differentiation of the science sphere. Here, Francis Bacon is hypercritical. He will say the following: the church has its role in morals, no question. And the church should probably begin to stay out of the arts, but if they want to have an opinion there, that's good. But science, different project entirely. Science involves a return back to the Aristotelian model and a departure from it. In other words, it is time to ask about the how of the world. Right? That is to say, the mechanization, the process itself. And in the moment that that happens, of course, we have the birth of the scientific, what we call it, method, right? Now, you're all familiar with that idea of the method. You begin with some kind of hypotheses. That hypothesis goes through a series of tests that provide data. That data is then replicatable and generalizable. And if it is generalizable and replicatable, then we will begin to say that we're moving from some idea to possibly a theorem to ultimately, in some schools of thought, facts. Will depend, we'll argue about that one to the end, right? You could make the argument epistemologically that is to say how one knows. That we move from a certain kind of absolutism, right, that is often associated with the school out of Jerusalem, to a certain kind of fallibility, the potentiality that we might be wrong. And of course, science itself will sometimes even go so far as to say nothing can be known. It's all kind of relative. And yet most of the time, thinkers and seekers of science are trying to follow this scientific method, and they are going to do it, they hope, without the power of the church. But we're all together familiar with the story of Galileo, who will just say, to who? Yeah, he's not talking to politicians, is he? Well, I guess he is to the degree that these church people are politicians. And he says, just look through the, just look through the canister. Just look. That's all I'm asking you. No. If you would just look, you'll know I'm right. No, we don't want to look because we already know. How do we know? Because we have a certain understanding of the Bible. That is our understanding of science. There it is, it's done. We don't want to look. And if you don't want to come our way, you're toast on a post. Galileo, of course, has to say, all right, you're right, I'm wrong. Whispers on his way out the room, I was right all along. And of course, history says, yeah. You could make the argument that thinkers like, I mentioned Descartes, Sir Isaac Newton is another classic example, who will produce for us the beginnings of this thing we will call modernity. Okay? Now, in conclusion, I'd like to set up further conversations by pointing out that by the time we move into the 1800s, we are clearly in a different time in Western thought than we were during the time, for example, the School of Jerusalem, the School of Athens. A totally different time. We've moved through the Middle Ages, past the Renaissance and the Reformation, and we now are at a really pivotal time in the middle 1800s to 1900s. You, of course, being born at the end of the 1900s, the 20th century. There's kind of lots of debate about this, but there's kind of three thinkers that will move modernity out of modernity to what we will often refer to as postmodern. Okay? Postmodern. Now, who gets, how do you even define a term like postmodern? You yourselves being born in what many scholars will qualify as a postmodern time. The easiest way to answer that is that the postmodern era went from a differentiation of the value spheres to a disassociation, okay, of the value spheres. That is to say this. So arts, morals, and science are completely disassociated. They're completely pulled apart. In other words, you would think about your three quarters as not being side by side separated, but completely different parts of the table. Meaning, ultimately, science is going to trump the other two in importance of value within Western thought. Okay? So, for example, if you were to have somebody who were to ask, okay, Western thought today, what's really important? I can say it to you this way. Play the game. Go home this evening and say to your folks that you live with, hey, the loony gave a lecture today, and I've decided that I'm A, going to college, and B, I know what I'm going to major in. And they're going to go, oh, that's great, what are you going to major in? I've decided I'm going to go and be a poet. I'm majoring in poetry. I'm going to major in poetry. And then just kind of sit back and watch your parents' face. Oh, poetry is... Same thing Dante's dad did, by the way. Dante's dad told him, you'll never be remembered if you got into poetry, you got to be a lawyer. Right? Okay. So, poetry is good. We like poetry. What are we going to get around to? Why did you write a 33 on the ACT if you're going to go major in poetry? What is it they want you to go to do? Well, see, it's funny, right? Because you can make a lot more bank going and get an engineering degree or a pre-med degree. Why? See, it's a funny question. I have seniors that go, I'll be danged, I never really thought about that. Why? Why is it that going and majoring in poetry, you will not make as much money in this culture, in this Western culture, as you can make if you go and study engineering, or physics, or chemistry, or medicine, or even law? Why is that? Of course, the answer is simple. Because we live in a culture that celebrates the value of science over the other two value spheres. How did that happen? Three names. The first, and we'll do this in order, the first is Darwin. You have to say Darwin is really significantly important in this movement. Because Darwin will write two classic texts, right? Origin of Man and Origin of Species and Descent of Man. And in both of these titles, he is going to say something quite radical about existence. He is going to say all of existence is understood as tension, biologically speaking. This rough and kind of ready view of the world that says, always the survival of the species is of greatest import. Darwin, interestingly, trained classically as a theologian, not a scientist. He writes theological treatises his whole life. and remains, many argue, a theologian all his life. He himself did not necessarily see what he was saying as that radical an idea. No question, one of the most radical thinkers, right, of the 1800s. No question. The second who follows in this strand is Marx, Karl Marx. Marx will come along and he will say, you know, what Darwin said about struggle, he's dead on right. But I'm going to trump him by saying there's not only biological struggle, but there is economic class struggle. He'll go back to Plato and back to our little triangle here, and he will say that struggle between peoples of classes will explain everything. In other words, if you were born under a bridge in Atlanta to a crack mom, you would probably not be sitting in this room listening to this lecture. Wow, that's a very interesting idea. In other words, we are our money. And we are the money that came before us. Long, long before us. Wow, this sounds kind of like Plato, huh? In other words, economics explains everything. Because if last night you didn't eat anything, you would have a different understanding right now of the things we're talking about. And if the night before that you didn't eat anything, and the night before that, that was the last packet of ramen and it had to be divided 5 ways. By the way, that happened last night in this town. In this town. Of 5,000. So you know it happened in bigger cities. Where a mom had to say to her 4 kids, we only got 1 pack of ramen. That's all we got, guys. Sorry, till I get paid again next month. That's it. How would that change the way you see the world? Marx said, radically change. To say otherwise is, of course, going to be kind of not really accepting truth. Marx will write Communist Manifesto and, of course, his Marxist revolutions of the 20th century. We know all about how those things work out, right? Okay. The third is Freud. So Darwin, Marx, Freud. And hey, you know what? There are other names we could throw here like Friedrich Nietzsche, and of course that's Streitz or Kierkegaard. I mean, there's a lot of thinkers that we could throw in here as being those individuals that are really the ones that are kind of moving the thinking, right? But we're going to go ahead and stick with Freud, and here's why. Freud says Darwin is right. No question there's biological struggle. Marx is right. There is a class struggle going on. But I can trump you one more than that. There is psychological struggle. The struggle of the mind. What's ironic is that this really radical thinker goes back to a tripartite view of the soul, sounding very much like who? Right, Plato. That is to say the id, the ego, the superego. For him, this division is going to have a whole lot to do to explain why we behave the way we behave and the way that we think. Into the 20th century we come. If you want to focus on literary artists, right, 1922 is a really important year. Because in the same year, T.S. Eliot will publish the most important poem of the 20th century called Wasteland. And James Joyce will publish the most important novel of the 20th century called Ulysses. Both texts we'll talk about soon. Okay. By the time you're born, there is great tension about the question, what does it mean to be in the West? Because the world has become, with the help of Steve Jobs and others, the world has become increasingly more global. Yes? So in other words, it's not so easy to talk about the West versus the East anymore. There are many people who in fact put one more post before modern and talk actually about your time period as not postmodern, but postmodern. That is to say, we have now entered a phase where technology allows for us to live much closer together. And obviously there's a lot of good that comes of that, a lot of scary stuff that as well comes of that. So just to finish now, I've given you a bit of a schemata, of an introduction, to this idea of what it means to talk about Western thought. We began, of course, with 2 schools of thought that never have gone away. For example, anybody that tries to argue, as Nietzsche, for example, will, God is dead or religion is dead, of course has to deal with the fact that the West isn't the West without the Middle Ages. And you can't have the Middle Ages without both legs, right? That is to say, as well, the classical period. Are you more Platonist? Are you more Aristotelian? See, notice these games continue to get played. And as long as you understand the discussion points, you can actually engage in conversation, which is one of the difficulties of having debate about left versus right, about liberal versus conservative. Without understanding this kind of background knowledge, those kinds of terms can be all over the place. Remember, Socrates said, always in discussions, define your terms. So I've given you at least some way to possibly define your terms. Thank you.